What happened when our teacher wouldn't call 911? I was halfway through question 17 on the American history final when Liam's head hit his desk. The sound echoed through the silent classroom like a gunshot, and everyone looked up from their papers. Mrs. Keller didn't even glance over from where she stood by the window, arms crossed, watching us like a prison guard. Liam was slumped forward with his face pressed against the exam booklet, and his arm hung limp off the side of the desk. I could see his fingers twitching slightly, but the rest of him was completely still. "Liam," Mrs. Keller called out without moving from her post. "Wake up, or you automatically fail this exam." Nobody else seemed concerned at first because Liam was always quiet and kept to himself, the kind of kid who sat in the back and never raised his hand. But something felt wrong about how still he was, how his shoulders weren't moving the way they should when someone's breathing normally. I put my pencil down and leaned forward to get a better look at him across the aisle. His lips had this weird bluish tint that made my stomach drop. "Mrs. Keller," I said, keeping my voice low because we weren't supposed to talk during finals. "I think something's actually wrong with Liam." She finally turned away from the window and walked down the aisle toward his desk, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. The whole class was watching now, 28 pairs of eyes following her movements as she stopped next to Liam and tapped his shoulder with one finger. "Liam Thompson, this is your final warning," she said in that stern voice she used when she thought someone was testing her authority. "Sit up and finish your exam, or I'm marking you as a failure right now." He didn't move at all, didn't even flinch when she tapped harder on his shoulder. I stood up from my desk without asking permission, and Mrs. Keller's head snapped toward me with this look of pure fury on her face. "Sit down immediately, or you'll be joining him with a failing grade," she snapped. But I ignored her and moved closer to Liam, close enough to see that his skin had gone pale and waxy. His chest was barely moving, these tiny, shallow breaths that didn't look right at all. "He's not breathing properly," I said, and my voice came out shakier than I wanted it to. "Something's really wrong." Mrs. Keller grabbed my arm and tried to pull me back to my seat, but I shook her off and reached for Liam's wrist to check his pulse, like they taught us in that mandatory CPR class last semester. His skin felt ice cold under my fingers, and it took me way too long to find a pulse. When I finally felt it, the beat was so faint and slow that I knew this wasn't someone taking a nap. "His pulse is barely there," I said louder this time so the whole class could hear. "We need to call 911 right now." Mrs. Keller's face went red, and she stepped between me and Liam's desk, like she was blocking me from getting any closer. "He's faking to get out of the test," she said with absolute certainty in her voice. "I've been teaching for 19 years, and I've seen every trick in the book. This is just another student trying to manipulate their way out of consequences." Behind me, I heard Destiny gasp from her seat in the front row. "Mrs. Keller, look at his lips. They're turning blue. That's not normal." Mrs. Keller glanced at Liam again, and I saw something flicker across her face, maybe doubt or concern, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "If I call 911, the police will come too," she said, and her voice dropped lower like she was sharing a secret. "They always send police to schools for these calls, and if Liam is on something he shouldn't be, which clearly he is based on this performance, then he'll get arrested. His whole future will be destroyed. Is that what you want?" The question hung in the air while I tried to process what she was saying. She was more worried about Liam getting in trouble than about him potentially dying right in front of us. "I don't care about that right now," I said, pulling out my phone from my pocket. "I'm calling anyway." Mrs. Keller moved faster than I expected, snatching the phone out of my hand before I could even unlock it. "No personal devices during finals," she said, slipping my phone into her desk drawer and turning the key in the lock. "That's an automatic 0 for academic dishonesty." The classroom erupted with voices as other students started protesting and demanding she give my phone back. Destiny stood up and pointed at Liam, whose head had rolled to the side so we could see his half-open eyes staring at nothing. "He needs help," she yelled over the noise. "Why are you doing this?" Mrs. Keller held up her hand for silence, and amazingly, everyone stopped talking. "I'm protecting Liam from making a mistake that will follow him for the rest of his life," she said, like she actually believed she was doing something noble. "Now everyone sit down and finish your exams. You have 43 minutes remaining." Nobody sat down, though. We all just stood there staring at her in disbelief, while Liam continued not moving at his desk. That's when Ophelia, who sat right next to Liam and rarely spoke in class, started crying. "He's my best friend," she said through sobs. "I know what he's been going through. Please just help him." Mrs. Keller's expression softened slightly as she looked at Ophelia's tear-streaked face. "Then you should have been a better friend and stopped him from taking whatever he took," she said coldly. "But calling the authorities now will only make everything worse for him. Trust me on this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every second we wasted arguing was another second Liam's brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. I remembered from the CPR training that brain damage could start happening within minutes of someone not breathing properly. "I'm going to start CPR," I said, moving toward Liam again. Mrs. Keller blocked my path completely this time, pressing her back against his desk. "You are not qualified to make that determination," she said. "And if you're wrong and he's fine, you could be liable for assault. Do you want to face legal consequences for assaulting another student?" The manipulation in her words was obvious to everyone now. She was using fear to keep us from doing what we all knew needed to be done. Destiny grabbed her backpack and started digging through it frantically. "I'm going to the office to get help," she announced. Mrs. Keller moved to the classroom door with surprising speed and stood in front of it, her hand on the knob. "Nobody leaves this room until the exam period is over," she said. "Those are the district testing protocols. If anyone walks out that door, you all get zeros for compromised test security." I looked around at my classmates and saw the same mix of fear and anger on their faces that I felt churning in my gut. We were trapped in here with a teacher who cared more about test scores than someone's life. Liam's breathing had become even more shallow, these tiny gasps that barely moved his chest at all. Ophelia pushed past Mrs. Keller and knelt next to Liam's desk, grabbing his hand and squeezing it. "Liam, please wake up," she begged. "Please don't do this. I need you to be okay." Mrs. Keller reached down and pulled Ophelia away by her shoulder, not roughly but firmly enough to make her stumble backward. "Emotional theatrics won't change my decision," she said. "Now everyone back to your seats immediately." That's when something inside me snapped. I walked straight up to Mrs. Keller and looked her dead in the eye. "If he dies because you wouldn't let us help him, that's on you," I said as calmly as I could manage even though my hands were shaking. "I hope you can live with that." She blinked once, twice, and I thought maybe I'd gotten through to her. But then her jaw set in that stubborn way, and she crossed her arms. "He's not going to die from being dramatic," she said. "You're all overreacting to a situation you don't understand." Behind us, there was a horrible sound as Liam started making this wet, gurgling noise in his throat. Ophelia screamed, and several other students jumped up from their seats. His body had gone completely limp, and now even I could tell he'd stopped breathing entirely. "Move," I said to Mrs. Keller, and when she didn't, I shoved past her toward Liam. She grabbed my arm, but I pulled free and dropped to my knees next to his desk. Up close, I could see his pupils were tiny pinpoints, and his skin felt like touching ice. I'd never done CPR on a real person before, only on the plastic dummy in health class, but I tilted his head back and checked his airway the way we'd been taught. "Someone time me," I yelled while positioning my hands on his chest. Destiny pulled out her contraband phone that she'd hidden in her bra and started the timer. "I've got you," she said. I started compressions, counting out loud and trying to remember the right rhythm. Mrs. Keller was on her classroom phone now, but she wasn't calling 911 like she should have been. I could hear her talking to someone at the main office, her voice low and urgent as she explained the situation in a way that made it sound like we were the problem. "One student is having what appears to be a medical episode," she was saying, "but I have concerns about the validity of the emergency given the timing during finals." My arms were already burning from the compressions, and I was only on number 15. Liam's chest felt wrong under my hands, too still and too cold, and I wondered if I was doing more harm than good. "Is he breathing yet?" Ophelia asked from somewhere behind me, her voice cracking. "Not yet," I said, trying to keep my own panic under control. "Someone count for me. I keep losing track." Destiny moved closer and started counting out loud while I pumped Liam's chest over and over. At 30 compressions, I stopped and tried to give rescue breaths the way we'd learned, tilting his head back and pinching his nose shut. His lips were freezing cold against mine and tasted like nothing, like death already. I breathed into his mouth twice and watched his chest barely rise. Nothing changed. He still wasn't breathing on his own. I went back to compressions, my arms shaking now from the effort. Mrs. Keller had finished her phone call and was standing behind her desk watching us with this unreadable expression on her face. "The nurse is on her way," she announced. "You can stop that now. The nurse can't fix this," I panted between compressions. "He needs paramedics. He needs a hospital." Mrs. Keller shook her head slowly. "The nurse will determine if we need to escalate to that level," she said. "I'm following proper protocol for medical emergencies on school property." I wanted to scream at her that there was no protocol that made sense here, that we were watching someone die while she worried about paperwork and procedure. 30 compressions later, I stopped and gave 2 more rescue breaths. Still nothing. Liam's face was taking on a grayish tint now, and I knew that couldn't be good. "How long has it been?" I asked Destiny. She checked her phone with trembling hands. 4 minutes and 18 seconds since you started CPR. 4 minutes. 4 minutes of his brain not getting enough oxygen. 4 minutes closer to permanent damage or death. I started compressions again, and this time Ophelia dropped down next to me. "Let me help," she said. "You're getting tired. We can switch off." We developed a rhythm where I'd do 30 compressions, and then she'd take over while I caught my breath. Mrs. Keller made no move to stop us anymore, just stood there watching with her arms crossed. The classroom door finally opened, and the school nurse rushed in carrying her medical bag. She was this older woman named Gladys, who'd been working here since before I was born. "What happened?" she asked, dropping to her knees next to us. "I think he overdosed on something," I said between gasps for air. "His pulse was barely there when I found it, and he stopped breathing completely a few minutes ago." Nurse Gladys put her fingers on Liam's neck to check for a pulse herself, then immediately pulled out her phone. "I'm calling 911, she said, already dialing. Mrs. Keller stepped forward. "Gladys, we need to think about the implications of involving law enforcement in what might be a student making poor choices." Nurse Gladys didn't even look up at her. "A student is dying, Patricia. I don't care about implications right now." She spoke rapidly to the 911 dispatcher, giving our school address and explaining the situation. When she mentioned possible overdose, I heard sirens start up in the distance almost immediately. Mrs. Keller's face had gone pale, and she sank into her chair behind her desk. "This is going to be a nightmare for the school," she muttered. Nurse Gladys pulled something out of her medical bag that looked like a small auto-injector. "This is Narcan," she explained while pulling the cap off. "If he's overdosed on opioids, this should reverse it." She positioned the injector against Liam's thigh and pressed down hard. There was a clicking sound as the needle deployed through his jeans. And then we all waited. Nothing happened at first. Ophelia was holding Liam's hand and crying silently, while I kept doing compressions because nobody had told me to stop. The sirens were getting louder now, close enough that they had to be pulling into the school parking lot. Then Liam gasped. It was this horrible wet sound, like someone drowning and finally breaking the surface. His whole body convulsed, and his eyes flew open, unfocused and terrified. "It's okay," Nurse Gladys said in this soothing voice. "You're okay, Liam. Help is here." He tried to sit up, but she gently held him down. "Stay still, honey. The paramedics are coming." The classroom door burst open, and 2 paramedics rushed in with their equipment. They took over immediately, checking Liam's vitals and asking Nurse Gladys rapid-fire questions about what she'd given him and when. One of them started an IV, while the other put an oxygen mask over Liam's face. "We need to transport immediately," the first paramedic said. They lifted Liam onto a stretcher with practiced efficiency, and I watched his hand slip out of Ophelia's grasp as they wheeled him toward the door. She tried to follow, but one of the paramedics held up a hand. "Family only in the ambulance," he said. "Are you his sister?" Ophelia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Best friend. Then you can meet us at County General," he said, not unkindly. "He's going to be okay." They were gone within seconds, leaving the rest of us standing in the classroom in shocked silence. My arms were still shaking from the CPR, and there was this weird ringing in my ears that wouldn't go away. Mrs. Keller stood up slowly from behind her desk. "Everyone back to your seats," she said in this hollow voice. "You still have 31 minutes to complete your exams." Nobody moved. We all just stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You can't be serious," Destiny said. "We just watched someone almost die." Mrs. Keller's hands were trembling as she gathered the exam papers scattered across Liam's desk. "The final must be completed according to district policy," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice anymore. "Any student who doesn't finish will receive an incomplete." I looked down at my hands and realized they were covered in Liam's sweat. I could still feel the resistance of his chest under my palms, still taste his cold lips from the rescue breaths. The idea of sitting back down and answering questions about the Missouri Compromise felt insane. "I'm done," I said, grabbing my backpack from where I'd left it by my desk. "I don't care about the grade." Destiny stood up too. "Same." One by one, the rest of the class started packing up their things. Within 2 minutes, everyone was standing with their bags, ready to walk out. Mrs. Keller looked around at all of us with something close to panic in her eyes. "You're all going to fail," she said. "Every single one of you." Ophelia was the one who responded, her voice steady, despite the tears still on her cheeks. "At least we'll fail knowing we tried to save someone's life," she said. "What will you have?" Mrs. Keller didn't have an answer for that. We filed out of the classroom in silence, leaving her alone with stacks of unfinished exams. Out in the hallway, Ophelia grabbed my arm. "Thank you," she said. "If you hadn't started CPR, he'd be dead right now." The words settled over me like a weight. He'd be dead. We'd been that close to watching someone die in American history class on a random Thursday in May. Principal Whitmore was waiting in the hallway with several security guards, his face red and his tie loosened like he'd been running. "What the hell happened in there?" he demanded. "Mrs. Keller called saying you all abandoned your finals." I explained everything while the other students nodded along and added details I'd missed. Principal Whitmore's expression changed from angry to horrified, to something I couldn't quite read as I described how Mrs. Keller had refused to call 911 and locked my phone in her desk. She was worried about Liam getting arrested, I finished. She said calling the police would ruin his future. Whitmore's jaw clenched. "Wait here," he said, then disappeared into Mrs. Keller's classroom. Through the small window in the door, I could see him talking to her, his gestures becoming more animated as the conversation went on. She was shaking her head and pointing at the exam papers like they proved something. He pulled out his own phone and made a call while she watched with her arms crossed defensively. When he came back out, his face was carefully neutral. "You're all excused for the day," he said. "Go home. We'll figure out the exam situation later." Destiny wasn't satisfied with that answer. "What's going to happen to Mrs. Keller?" she asked. "That's a personnel matter I can't discuss with students," Whitmore said in that administrator voice that meant the conversation was over. But we all knew what that meant. Nothing was going to happen, or at least nothing we'd ever hear about. The school would protect its own, sweep this under the rug, maybe give her a stern warning in private and call it handled. I went home and spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on my bed staring at the wall. My mom came home from work and found me like that, still in the clothes that smelled like sweat and fear. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting next to me. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. "You did the right thing," she said. "You saved that boy's life." But it didn't feel like victory. It felt hollow and wrong, like I'd won a battle, but the war was still raging. That night, Ophelia texted the whole class with an update. Liam was stable at County General. The doctors said the Narcan had saved him, and if we'd waited even a few more minutes, he would have suffered permanent brain damage or death. She didn't mention what he'd taken or why, and nobody asked. The next morning, I showed up to school dreading what would happen next. Would Mrs. Keller be there? Would we have to pretend everything was normal? Would the administration acknowledge what happened or sweep it under the bureaucratic rug? I got my answer when I walked into American history and found a substitute teacher sitting at Mrs. Keller's desk. A thin woman with graying hair and kind eyes who introduced herself as Ms. Novak and explained that Mrs. Keller would be out for the foreseeable future due to personal reasons. The class exchanged glances, but nobody said anything. Personal reasons. That's what they were calling it. Ms. Novak announced that our finals would be rescheduled and the previous day's exam would not count toward our grades. I understand there was an incident yesterday, she said carefully. The administration wanted me to let you know that counselors are available if anyone needs to talk about what happened. During lunch, I found Ophelia sitting alone in the cafeteria, picking at a sandwich she wasn't eating. I sat down across from her without asking if it was okay. "How are you holding up?" I asked. She looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "I knew he was struggling," she said quietly. "He told me last week that he couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The finals, his parents' expectations, all of it. I thought he was just stressed. I didn't think he'd—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. "It's not your fault," I said, even though I knew the words probably sounded empty to her. "You couldn't have known he'd do this." Ophelia shook her head. "But I did know, in a way. He was dropping hints, pulling away from everyone. I should have told someone." We sat in silence for a while, neither of us knowing what to say that would make any of this better. The cafeteria buzzed with normal lunch conversations around us, people laughing and complaining about homework and making plans for the weekend. It felt surreal that life was just continuing like nothing had happened. That afternoon, Principal Whitmore called an emergency assembly in the gym. The entire junior class filed in and sat on the bleachers while he stood at a podium looking uncomfortable. "I'm sure you've all heard about yesterday's medical emergency," he began, his voice echoing through the space. "I want to assure you that the safety and well-being of our students is our highest priority." I almost laughed at that. Our highest priority. If that were true, Mrs. Keller would have called 911 the second she realized something was wrong instead of worrying about test protocols and police involvement. Whitmore droned on about new procedures they'd be implementing. Emergency training for all staff, better communication systems, all the things they should have had in place already. When he opened the floor for questions, Destiny stood up. "Is Mrs. Keller being fired?" she asked directly. The gym went silent. Everyone wanted to know the answer to that question. Whitmore cleared his throat. "As I mentioned earlier, I can't discuss personnel matters, but I can say that we're conducting a thorough investigation and will take appropriate action based on our findings." More administrative doublespeak. Destiny wasn't backing down, though. She refused to call 911 when a student was dying. She locked phones in her desk, so we couldn't call for help ourselves. She cared more about test scores than someone's life. What investigation is needed? A few students started clapping. And then more joined in until the gym was filled with applause. Whitmore's face turned red. "That's enough," he said firmly. "I understand you're upset, but there are proper channels for these concerns. Making accusations in a public forum is not productive." But the damage was done. The whole school knew what had happened now, and no amount of administrative spin could change the narrative. Word spread like wildfire, and by the end of the day, Mrs. Keller's story was all over social media. I spent the next week in this weird limbo where everything felt both too intense and oddly normal at the same time. Classes continued, homework got assigned, other teachers acted like nothing had happened. But there was this undercurrent of tension running through everything, this unspoken awareness that we'd all witnessed something that couldn't be undone. Ophelia started a petition demanding the school implement better emergency response protocols and mandatory mental health training for all staff. Within 3 days, over 800 students had signed it. She presented it to Principal Whitmore with photographers from the local newspaper there to document the moment. 2 weeks after the incident, I got called to the principal's office. Whitmore sat behind his desk with a woman I didn't recognize, someone in a gray suit who introduced herself as Felicia Ramos from the district's legal department. "We wanted to thank you for your quick thinking during the emergency," Ramos said with a practiced smile. "Your actions likely saved a fellow student's life." I waited for the other shoe to drop. There was always another shoe. "However," she continued, and there it was, "we need to discuss some concerns about the narrative that's developed around this incident. Mrs. Keller has retained legal counsel, and there are claims being made that don't align with her account of events." My stomach dropped. "Her account?" I repeated. "What's her version exactly?" Ramos pulled out a folder and flipped it open. "Mrs. Keller maintains that she was in the process of calling for help when you and other students became confrontational and prevented her from following proper emergency protocols. She says the situation escalated due to student misconduct rather than any negligence on her part." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was trying to rewrite history, to make herself the victim, and us the problem. "That's a lie," I said flatly. "She refused to call 911. She said it would ruin Liam's future if police got involved. She locked my phone in her desk when I tried to call myself. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The issue is that it becomes a matter of conflicting accounts. Without physical evidence or recordings, we have to consider both perspectives. There were 28 witnesses, I said, my voice rising. Everyone in that classroom saw what happened. Ramos nodded like she'd expected this response. Student testimony can be problematic in these situations. Memories become influenced by group dynamics, and teenagers are particularly susceptible to social pressure to conform to a dominant narrative. She was calling us liars without actually saying the words, calling our memories unreliable because we were teenagers, as if being young automatically made us incapable of knowing what we'd seen with our own eyes. Is there anything else? I asked coldly. Because I have class. Whitmore sighed. We're not trying to attack your character or doubt your intentions. We just need you to understand that this situation is complicated, and resolution may not look the way you expect it to. I stood up. What I understand is that a teacher almost let someone die because she was more worried about test scores than human lives, and now the school is more concerned with protecting her than admitting something went horribly wrong. Is that complicated enough? I walked out without waiting to be dismissed. That night, my mom got a call from Ramos, asking if we'd be willing to sign a statement acknowledging that Mrs. Keller's actions had been reasonable under the circumstances, in exchange for the school covering any therapy costs I might need from the trauma of the incident. Mom told her exactly where she could shove that statement. The story hit the local news 3 days later. A reporter had gotten hold of my 911 call, or rather, the lack of one, because of Mrs. Keller locking my phone away. They played the dispatch logs, showing that the only call that came in was from Nurse Gladys, a full 8 minutes after students first noticed Liam in distress. 8 minutes. An eternity when someone's dying. The news segment interviewed Ophelia, who explained through tears how her best friend had nearly died while a teacher prioritized test protocol over human life. They interviewed Destiny, who described watching Mrs. Keller physically block the door to prevent anyone from leaving to get help. And they tried to interview me, but my mom said no. She didn't want me more involved in this than I already was, didn't want me to become the face of this tragedy. Public pressure mounted. Parents started showing up to school board meetings demanding accountability. The teachers' union released a statement defending Mrs. Keller's right to due process while carefully avoiding any specifics about what she'd actually done. Local advocacy groups picked up the story, and suddenly our small suburban school was being held up as an example of everything wrong with prioritizing standardized testing over student well-being. Through it all, Liam stayed silent. He'd been released from the hospital after 3 days and immediately transferred to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. Ophelia was the only one of us who got to visit him, and she came back from those visits looking exhausted and sad. He's not ready to talk about what happened, she told us one day at lunch. He's embarrassed that everyone knows now, embarrassed that he failed at even trying to die. The words hit hard. He'd been trying to die. This wasn't an accidental overdose or a stupid mistake. Liam had made a calculated decision to end his life during that final, and Mrs. Keller's refusal to call 911 had nearly made it successful. 4 weeks after the incident, the school district held a press conference announcing the results of their investigation. I watched it on my phone during study hall, my hands clenching tighter with every corporate phrase and bureaucratic dodge. The superintendent, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit, stood at a podium and read from prepared remarks. While we found that Mrs. Keller's response to the emergency fell short of district standards, we do not believe her actions rose to the level of willful negligence or malicious intent. She has been placed on administrative leave and will undergo additional training before being eligible to return to the classroom. Administrative leave. Training. Not fired, not prosecuted, just temporarily inconvenienced. The superintendent continued. We're implementing new emergency response protocols across all district schools, including immediate 911 notification requirements for any suspected medical emergency, regardless of other circumstances. So they'd learned something at least, but only after a kid almost died. Only after we'd screamed and begged and done CPR ourselves while the adult in the room worried about test scores. The comments on the news station's website were split. Half the people calling Mrs. Keller a monster who should never teach again, the other half defending her as an educator in an impossible situation who'd made a judgment call that turned out wrong. Nobody seemed to want to acknowledge the middle ground, that maybe she wasn't evil, but had been so twisted by a system that valued metrics over humanity that she'd lost sight of what actually mattered. I spent a lot of time thinking about that in the weeks that followed. How many other teachers would have done the same thing in her position? How many times had similar situations played out in classrooms across the country where a student in crisis got dismissed as faking because acknowledging the truth would complicate test administration? The thought kept me up at night. Memorial Day weekend came and went. School wound down toward the end of the year with the strange momentum that always builds in those final weeks. Teachers assigned culminating projects instead of finals. Yearbooks got signed. Senior pranks happened and got shut down by administration. And Liam came back to school. He showed up on a Thursday morning looking thinner and paler than before, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke to sleepless nights and heavy medication. Ophelia stayed by his side constantly those first few days back, a protective presence that kept other students from asking the questions we all wanted to ask, but knew better than to voice. I caught his eye once in the hallway between classes, and he gave me this tiny nod of acknowledgement. Nothing dramatic, no tearful thank you or emotional speech about how I'd saved his life. Just that small gesture that said, "I see you, I know what you did, and I'm here because of it." It felt like enough. The substitute teacher who'd taken over our American history class announced that our final exam would be optional. Anyone who wanted to take it could, but the grade would only count if it helped us. Anyone who didn't want to take it would have their grade calculated from their previous work throughout the year. I chose not to take it. The exam felt poisoned somehow, tainted by what had happened the last time we'd tried to complete it. Most of the class made the same choice. On the last day of school, someone had written 28V1 in chalk on the wall outside Mrs. Keller's old classroom. 28 students who'd stood up against one teacher who'd forgotten that test scores don't mean anything if the people taking them don't survive to see the results. Administration had it cleaned off by lunch, but someone took a photo first, and it circulated online for weeks. That summer, I worked at my uncle's construction company and tried not to think about the way Liam's chest had felt under my hands, or the blue tint his lips had taken on, or the cold, cold feeling of his skin. But sometimes at night, I'd wake up from dreams where I couldn't find his pulse, where the CPR didn't work, where the paramedics arrived too late and had to call time of death instead of starting an IV. Therapy helped. My mom had found someone who specialized in trauma from life-threatening situations, and I went every Thursday afternoon and talked about fear and responsibility and the weight of knowing you held someone's life in your hands. The therapist taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques and helped me understand that I'd done everything right, that the outcome wasn't my fault, that I couldn't control what other people chose to do or not do. Senior year started in the fall with new emergency protocols posted in every classroom. Big red buttons installed by the doors that directly contacted 911 without requiring teacher approval. Mandatory response training for all staff. Anonymous reporting systems for students worried about peers in crisis. All good changes, all necessary, all coming just a little too late for Liam. Mrs. Keller never came back to our school. The rumor mill said she'd taken a position at a private school in another state, somewhere her past wouldn't follow her. Nobody knew if that was true, or if she'd left teaching entirely. Nobody seemed to care enough to find out. Liam joined the swim team and started volunteering at a crisis hotline. Ophelia started a mental health awareness club that met every Wednesday after school. Destiny organized a fundraiser for organizations that provided free counseling to teenagers. We'd all been changed by those minutes in the classroom, marked by the experience in ways both visible and invisible. I learned that saving someone's life doesn't feel like the movies make it seem. There's no swelling music or moment of triumph, just the hollow relief of knowing you did what needed to be done, mixed with anger at the adult who should have helped but chose policy over humanity. The college essays I wrote that fall were all about those minutes of CPR, about the choice between following rules and following conscience, about how sometimes doing the right thing means standing up to people who are supposed to know better. My English teacher said they were powerful, but suggested I might want to write about something less controversial for my applications. I kept them anyway. In November, I got an email from a woman named Rita Alvarez, who identified herself as Liam's mother. She'd gotten my contact information from Ophelia and wanted to thank me in person. We met at a coffee shop downtown on a Saturday afternoon, and she hugged me before I even sat down. "You gave me my son back," she said, tears already streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you for that." I didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to explain that I'd just been scared and trying to remember CPR training and hoping I wasn't making everything worse. "I'm glad he's okay," I managed finally. Rita pulled out her phone and showed me photos of Liam. Current ones, not the school pictures from before. He looked healthier, happier, like someone who'd decided living was worth the effort after all. "He's doing really well now," she said. "Therapy is helping. Medication is helping. Having friends who care about him is helping. He wants me to tell you that he's sorry for putting you in that position." "He doesn't need to apologize," I said quickly. "He was in pain. People in pain do desperate things." Rita nodded, wiping her eyes. "The school district settled with us. They're paying for his ongoing treatment and therapy. It's not justice exactly, but it's something." I thought about Mrs. Keller and her new job somewhere, probably still prioritizing test scores over student well-being because the system rewarded that behavior. I thought about Principal Whitmore still sitting in his office, about the superintendent who'd called it a learning opportunity, about all the adults who'd failed and faced no real consequences. "It's something," I agreed, even though it felt like not nearly enough. Before we parted ways, Rita grabbed my hand. "If you ever need anything, if there's ever anything I can do for you, please don't hesitate to ask. You're part of our family now." The words stayed with me long after we'd said goodbye. Graduation came in the spring, and our class was smaller than it should have been because 3 students hadn't made it to the finish line. 1 car accident in February, 1 cancer diagnosis that moved too fast, and 1 empty chair that wasn't empty anymore because Liam walked across that stage and accepted his diploma with tears streaming down his face. The ceremony felt different than I'd expected, less triumphant, more solemn. We'd survived something together, and the survival felt more significant than any test score or grade point average. My name got called and I walked across the stage to polite applause. My parents were crying in the audience, and I knew they were thinking about those minutes in the classroom when things could have gone so differently. Afterward, Liam found me in the crowd of graduates taking photos with family. "Hey," he said, looking uncomfortable in his cap and gown. "I wanted to say something to you before we all head off to different places." I waited while he gathered his thoughts. "I don't remember much from that day," he said finally. "But I remember waking up in the ambulance and the paramedic saying someone had done CPR, that someone had refused to let me go. I think about that a lot." "I'm glad you're here," I said, and meant it with everything in me. He nodded and stuck out his hand. I shook it, and he pulled me into a quick hug that felt significant in ways I couldn't articulate. We said goodbye with promises to keep in touch that we both knew we probably wouldn't keep. People move on, lives diverge, and sometimes the bonds formed in trauma don't survive the transition to normal life. That night I sat on my bed looking at photos from graduation and thought about Mrs. Keller. Was she thinking about us too? Did she ever wonder what happened to the student she'd almost let die in her classroom? Did she feel guilt? Or did she still believe she'd been right to prioritize protocol over panic? I'd never know. And maybe that was for the best. College started in the fall, and I declared a major in public health with a focus on emergency response systems. If I couldn't change what had already happened, at least I could work toward making sure it happened less frequently to other people in other schools. The CPR certification I'd gotten in high school wasn't enough anymore. I took advanced courses, became an EMT, volunteered with crisis response teams. Every time I responded to a call, I thought about Liam's cold skin and shallow breathing. Thought about the minutes that had mattered so much, and the adult who'd thought they didn't matter at all. I learned that the system I'd grown up in, the one that had almost killed my classmate, wasn't unique to our school or our district. It was everywhere. This tendency to prioritize metrics and protocols over human needs, test scores over safety, compliance over compassion, control over care, and I learned that changing systems meant working within them, understanding them, finding the pressure points where one person's actions could make a difference. It was slow work, frustrating work that often felt futile. But every time I helped implement a new emergency protocol, or trained a group of teachers on crisis response, or convinced an administrator that student well-being had to come before test security, I thought about those 28 students who'd stood together against authority, because we'd known, even as teenagers, that something was terribly wrong. 5 years later, I was working as a coordinator for a nonprofit that specialized in school safety protocols when I got an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line just said, "Thank you," and when I opened it, there was a photo attached. Liam stood on a beach somewhere, tan and smiling, wearing a t-shirt that said, "Still here," in bold letters. The email itself was short. "Finished my master's in social work last month. Starting a job in August working with at-risk teenagers. Figured you'd want to know that your CPR training paid off in more ways than one. Thanks for not giving up on me when it would have been easier to listen to the authority figure in the room." I printed the email and pinned it to my cubicle wall, right next to my EMT certification and my nonprofit's mission statement. Sometimes at night, I still dreamed about that classroom, about Mrs. Keller blocking the door, about Liam's blue lips and cold skin. But now the dreams always ended with him breathing on his own, with the paramedics arriving, with all of us walking out of that room alive. 28 students who'd learned that day that rules are made by people, and people can be wrong. That authority figures don't always deserve the authority they're given. That sometimes the right thing to do is the thing you'll get in trouble for. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave your take below.